All right, everybody, make sure you have your note sheet out. We're taking a look at the response to the economic collapse. If you recall in class on Monday, we examined the 7 causes of the Great Depression. What we're now going to take a look at is not only the human impact of the Great Depression, but also how the government will respond. The very first thing I want to share with you is the mastery question, so make sure you can answer this by the end of viewing this, is how did the federal government begin to respond to the economic collapse that began in 1929? The first thing that, like I said, we're going to examine is the human impact. So in 1932, Americans across the country were feeling the pain of the economic collapse that was triggered by the stock market crash in 1929. Job seekers went from town to town in a quest to seek work. One of the first things that really happened was in Portland, Oregon, an unemployed veteran of World War I, his name was Walter Waters, persuaded a group of former soldiers to launch a protest march all the way to Washington, D.C. What he had hoped to do was persuade Congress to accelerate the payment of a long-promised bonus to World War I veterans. The promise dated back to 1924, and Congress would pay former soldiers $1 for every day that they served in the war, plus 25 cents for every day that they spent overseas. The catch was, though, that they would not receive the bonus until 1945. So what Waters had hoped is that, considering veterans argued that they needed the money sooner rather than later to help them through hard times, that this would be an effort for Congress to pay them early. They came to be known as the Bonus Army, and Waters and 250 other veterans traveled from Portland, headed east in May of 1932, and they just amassed a much larger group as they went east, usually by train. By the end of May, they had reached the nation's capital, and they had set up along the Anacostia River, just a few blocks away from the Capitol building where you see the bonus marchers in this image here. And here is where they hoped that a sympathetic Congress would pass a bill to pay their bonus right away. So by early summer of 1932, 12,000 veterans had arrived in Washington. One of the other things that went on is rapid unemployment and businesses failing. In 1929 through 1933, we saw 1 in 7 businesses fail. By 1933, as you can see on the graph here, about 25% of Americans were out of work. In comparison, only about 3% of the population was jobless prior to the stock market crash in 1929. When companies let people go, usually it was the very young, then elderly, followed by minority workers that were let go in that order. African American unemployment got as high as 50% in some cities. Farmers also went through some difficult times. So they had troubles directly after World War I and even into the 20s, but as unemployment reduced, consumers' buying power went up, and in some situations, when things got worse, farmers could no longer afford to sell their crops. So the result was that they couldn't make mortgage payments to banks that loaned them money, and farmers often sold their farms far less than what they had paid for their land. Those who could not sell their farms usually lost them in foreclosure, which is the legal process that allows a lender to take over a property after which it has helped a borrower to buy. The direct result of all of these factors was an increasing number of people losing their homes, and what we see are the development of what we called Hoovervilles sprang up around many cities. So Hoovervilles were makeshift villages and shanty towns. The makeshift settlements were nicknamed Hoovervilles by those who believed that President Herbert Hoover had not done enough to combat the Depression. In addition to this, to the homelessness, we saw a rise in hunger. So to feed the hungry, soup kitchens sprang up across the country. Soup was easy to prepare, and it could be increased in order to feed more people simply by adding water. There was also bread lines, which were long lines of people waiting for their bowl of soup and a piece of bread, and that became a very common sight. And obviously in this image you can see how this line literally stretches around city blocks in order to feed all these individuals. For many, this would be the only meal that some people would eat in a given day. At one point in New York City, had 82 soup kitchens, which they would provide the needy with about 85,000 meals per day. Another issue more on the Great Plains was that as the year 1931 began, many farmers in the Great Plains were optimistic. Wheat prices were holding up despite the Depression, and prospects for a record-breaking crop looked good. That summer, the rains abruptly stopped and crops began to wither, and strong winds began to blow across the plains. So at first, farmers on the plains viewed the disastrous summer of 31 as a freak of nature, thinking that 32 would be different. However, the following year, farmers waited for the rain that was needed to nurse the crop, and that never came. As disruptive as the drought was, it was not as bad as the dust storms. The blowing dust became so thick that people called the dust storms black blizzards, as you can see in this image here. People tried to protect themselves by covering their face with a cloth and tack sheets over doorways, but this did very little. The prolonged drought affected 100 million acres of farmland in Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas. So as you can see through some of these images, I mean, literally it is feet of dust that are piling up, not just around cars and tractors and other farm equipment, but homes as well. A journalist traveling through this region at the time, which you can see in the orange and on the outer skirts of it in the yellow, called this time period the Dust Bowl. And it was a name that stuck. Sorry about this. Usually the refugees of the Dust Bowl headed to nearby cities in hopes of finding work. However, with unemployment rates still high, jobs scarce, a lot of people left the region, like you see this group of people on the far right, which came to be known as the Okies. The fictional family in John Steinbeck's novel, The Dust Bowl Migrants, the title of the book was The Grapes of Wrath. Those who often left these areas affected by the Dust Bowl went down Route 66 to California. California was appealing to these migrants because it promised people of farm work in the fertile Central Valley. And as I said earlier, Californians named these newcomers Okies because many of them came from Oklahoma. So let's take a look at the ideological response to the crisis. How is the government, or how should the government, handle situations that is affecting the nation as greatly as it is? Politicians and other public figures propose different ways to deal with the country's economic problems, but people's ideologies shared many of their suggestions. So first of all, you got to understand that an ideology is a set of basic ideas, beliefs, values that form the basis of a social, economic, political philosophy or program. So just to give you an example, well, we're going to talk about Herbert Hoover first, something that in 1932 President President Roosevelt said in a metaphor to explain the difference between ideological responses to the Depression. He said that the civilization is a tree which grows continually, produces rotten dead wood. The radical says cut it down. The conservative says don't touch it, and the liberal says let's prune so we neither lose the old trunk or the new branches. So while we've heard of these terms, radical, conservative, and liberal, let's kind of go through them again. First of all, a conservative is a person, in this case we'll use Herbert Hoover as an example, who values self-reliance and individual responsibility. As the Depression worsened, conservatives resisted calls for radical change to improve the economy and the government's role. So left alone, they argue that the economy would stabilize and begin to improve. We talked about this with laissez-faire economics during the Gilded Age. The liberal, during the Depression and onward, typically are individuals who look to the government to expand its role in regulating economic affairs and promoting equality for all Americans. Liberals suggested placing taxes on corporations and wealthy individuals to raise money for those in need. So they oftentimes seek to redistribute money from those who have to those who have not. Radical, and we're going to use Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Soviet Union. While I should mention there were radicals in the United States, but a radical is someone who wants to make sweeping social, political, and economic changes to society. So in the 30s, socialists and communists attracted support for their call for radical change. Communists, for example, wanted to replace capitalism with communism, and we've talked about under that system, economic decisions would move completely into the hands of government planners, and wealth would be redistributed to people according to their need. So let's take a look at Hoover first to see how he responded to this situation. Again, a conservative. So President Hoover, like I said, a conservative, was the first president to deal with the woes of the Depression. He strongly believed in self-reliance, something that he called rugged individualism, which is defined here, basically how the federal government should not interfere with the American people's lives, and more than anything, hard work. His own life reflected some of these principles. He was orphaned at age 9. He became a millionaire and eventually a respected public official. We talked about him as being the director of the Food Administration and later the Secretary of Commerce under Calvin Coolidge. He knew of the suffering of Americans, but like many conservatives, didn't believe the federal government should give aid to the needy. Federal relief, he said, would undermine self-reliance and encourage people to become dependent on government handouts. So instead, he supported mutual self-help through voluntary giving. So what he's basically saying is that the government should basically be the promoter of solutions, not the legislator of solutions. So what does he do? He takes a very cautious approach. He viewed the American economy as sound, and he felt that it was his job to generate optimism and restore confidence. By doing so, the next step would be that he thinks that optimistic business owners would restore confidence, who in turn would expand their production of their goods. What this would lead to would be confident consumers who would spend more money, and the economy would bounce back without any direct government involvement. So as this was happening, Hoover looked to local communities, mainly through people's churches and private charities, to take care of citizens, not the government doing this. Unfortunately, over time, unemployment continued to rise, as did the number of Hoovervilles. As we see here, these are actually Hoovervilles in Chicago. Many people basically built these things out of cardboard and whatever else they could find. People still continued to go hungry. Desperate families tried to boost crop prices. Farmers tried to boost crop prices by causing shortages, by burning crops or sticking up milk trucks, as we had talked about. Some people even sleeping on what came to be known as Hoover blankets, otherwise known as newspaper. So what caused Hoover to rethink the government's role in the economic crisis was not what you're seeing here, but what it was really bank failures. Initially, Hoover asked healthy banks to loan money to banks that were suffering. When this didn't work, he supported the creation of what came to be known as a government agency to save failing banks and businesses, usually through what I have listed right here known as bank runs. So people running to the bank to get their money out before it closes, because once it closed, it wouldn't be there any longer. So he opened what was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And what this government agency was responsible for was issuing loans to banks, railroads, and other businesses. He hoped the RFC would stimulate economic growth and would lead to companies to begin to hire again. The prosperity would trickle down to those in need. Trickle-down theory, if you take a look at this, if you poured it into this top glass and then keep pouring, it would flow down to the glasses below. So the top being the very wealthy, the bottom being the very poor. You help those at the top, and eventually it'll work down to the very bottom. So this trickle-down theory was criticized by liberals because they said the poor could not wait for money to seep down from expanding business. They needed relief right away. So Hoover would eventually expand the RFC to loan money to states that had no longer enough resources to help the needy. To his credit, bank failures decreased in 1932, but the Depression would continue on. He would advocate for some public works projects, probably the most notable, the creation of the Hoover Dam, which is kind of a controversial name considering Hoover's considered to be the face of the Great Depression. Going back to this final thing, there's really one other thing for his legacy, and it's the Bonus Army. So initially when the Bonus Army arrived in D.C., he ignored them in hopes of them going away. But on June 17, 1932, Congress defeated the bill that would pay the Bonus Army immediately. Many veterans gave up and went home. However, over 10,000 veterans refused to leave. Hoover feared that the remaining veterans might become violent, and he called for them to be removed. So on July 28th, 1932, what the troops did is they used tear gas and tanks to push the veterans out of Washington. Hoover called this a challenge to the authority of the United States government, has been met swiftly and firmly. Americans, however, disagreed with Hoover, viewing it appalling how a president would use troops against former American troops. So to close, as we take a look at this election map of 1932, we're obviously going to see that Hoover will not be around post 1932.